The storm had been merciless for 3 days, and now the silence felt worse than the howling wind. Martha pressed her face to the frost-covered window, watching her breath fog the glass as she counted the meager potatoes left in their cellar. 7. 7 potatoes for her and 3 children, and winter had barely begun. The knock on her door came like thunder. Martha's heart seized. No one traveled in weather like this unless they were desperate or dangerous. Her eldest, Samuel, only 12 but already carrying the weight of the man he'd have to become, stepped protectively in front of his younger sisters. Little Beth, barely 6, clutched her cornhusk doll tighter, while 9-year-old Mary's eyes went wide with that particular fear children learn when their world becomes uncertain. "Mrs. Coleman?" The voice was deep, weathered, unfamiliar. Martha's hand trembled as she reached for the rifle above the mantel. Her husband Thomas had been gone 8 months now, claimed by the consumption that had swept through their valley like a plague. She'd learned to be suspicious of strangers, especially when they knew her name. "What do you want?" she called through the door, her voice steadier than her hands. "Name's Jacob Hartwell. I run the spread about 10 miles east. Got caught in this weather, and my horse threw a shoe. I'm asking for shelter, ma'am, just for the night." Martha knew the name. Hartwell owned one of the largest ranches in the territory, employed half the men in 3 counties. She'd never met him, but Thomas had spoken of him, said he was fair but hard, the kind of man who'd built his empire with his own calloused hands. "I can pay for my keep," Hartwell added, and Martha heard something in his voice that gave her pause. Not desperation, but loneliness. Samuel shook his head vigorously, but Martha was already calculating. 7 potatoes, 3 children, 1 night. The man owned thousands of head of cattle, and she was counting vegetables like gold coins. Her hand moved to the door latch, then stopped. Through the window, she could see his silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, steam rising from his coat in the bitter cold. Behind him, his horse stood with one leg favored, head down against the wind. The choice felt bigger than shelter. It felt like stepping across a line she couldn't see. Martha opened the door to find Jacob Hartwell removing his hat, snow melting in his graying hair. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 50, with lines carved deep around his eyes, the kind that came from squinting across vast distances, measuring weather and men with equal scrutiny. But his eyes held something she hadn't anticipated, genuine gratitude. "Much obliged, ma'am." He stepped inside, careful to wipe his boots, taking in the sparse room with a single sweeping glance. The children huddled together like birds in a storm, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "Children, this is Mr. Hartwell," Martha said, her voice carrying a warning. "He'll be staying just tonight." Hartwell nodded to each child individually. Samuel, Mary, Beth. The fact that he had somehow learned their names before knocking sent a chill through Martha that had nothing to do with the cold. "How do you—" "Your husband worked my north pasture for 2 seasons before." Hartwell's voice trailed off respectfully. "Thomas spoke of you all often. Good man. I was sorry to hear." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Martha felt exposed, as if this stranger could see straight through to her desperation. The empty pantry, the thin blankets, the way her children had grown quiet in recent weeks, no longer asking for second helpings because they understood there weren't any. "I was fixing to make supper," Martha said carefully. "Nothing fancy. Potato soup." "That sounds fine, ma'am." Hartwell's eyes flicked to the small pile of potatoes on the counter, and Martha saw him make his own calculation. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. As Martha began preparing their meager meal, Hartwell sat heavily at their rough-hewn table, removing items from his coat. A bottle of whiskey, which he set aside without opening, a leather pouch that clinked with coins, and finally, wrapped in oiled cloth, what appeared to be dried beef and a small sack of cornmeal. "Trail rations," he said simply, "in case the weather turned." Martha's hand stilled over the potatoes. The dried beef alone would feed her family for days, the cornmeal, weeks. "That's yours," she said quietly. "No one's leaving hungry tonight," Hartwell declared, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Not on my watch." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. But inside, something had shifted. Martha caught Samuel's eyes, saw the boy's suspicious frown deepen. Mary whispered something to Beth that made the little girl nod solemnly. They all felt it. This moment balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and something else entirely. The meal had been the finest they'd shared in months. Hartwell's trail rations mixed with Martha's potatoes had created something approaching abundance, and for the first time in weeks, her children had gone to sleep with full bellies. But Martha couldn't shake the feeling that she'd accepted more than food, that some invisible debt had been incurred. She was banking the fire when the sound reached them. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. Hartwell was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip with practiced ease. "Expecting company, ma'am?" Martha shook her head, fear climbing her throat. "No one rides in weather like this unless they're true. Acking someone," Hartwell finished grimly. The riders pulled up outside, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold. Martha counted at least 4 distinct voices, maybe 5, men talking in low, urgent tones. "Jacob Hartwell!" one of them called out. "We know you're in there! Come out peaceful, and nobody gets hurt!" Martha's blood turned to ice. She looked at Hartwell, saw something dangerous flicker behind his weathered features. Not fear, but the cold calculation of a man accustomed to violence. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Men with a grudge," Hartwell said quietly. "I fired their foreman last week, caught him selling my cattle, keeping the profits. Turns out he had friends." "Hartwell," the voice came again, closer now. "You cost us our livelihood. Time to settle accounts." Samuel appeared at the top of the stairs, awakened by the shouting. Behind him, Martha could see Mary's frightened face peeking around the corner. This was her worst nightmare, her children caught in someone else's war. "There's a back way out," she said urgently. "Through the root cellar. You can—" "No," Hartwell's voice was granite. "I don't run, and I won't bring trouble down on your family. You already have." The words escaped before Martha could stop them. Hartwell looked at her for a long moment, something painful passing across his features. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon I have." Outside, she heard the distinct sound of rifles being cocked. One of the men laughed, harsh and mean. "Clock's ticking, Hartwell. You coming out, or do we come in and get you?" Martha's hands shook as she reached for Thomas's rifle. 7 months of widow's determination crystallized into something harder than fear. These men thought they could use her home as a battlefield, threaten her children to settle their score. They were about to learn otherwise. "Mrs. Coleman," Hartwell's voice was soft, respectful. "I need you to trust me." Martha kept the rifle trained on the door, her finger light on the trigger. "Trust isn't something I can afford anymore." "I know." Hartwell moved carefully to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 5 men, all armed. "They want me, not you, but men like this." He trailed off, but Martha understood. Men like this wouldn't care about the difference between guilt and innocence, between a rancher and the widow who'd shown him shelter. "Mama?" Mary's voice came from the stairs, small and frightened. "Stay upstairs, baby," Martha called back, never taking her eyes off Hartwell. "Keep your sisters quiet." Hartwell turned from the window, and Martha saw something unexpected in his expression. Not the hardened calculation she'd expected, but genuine anguish. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. "Your husband gave me this," he said quietly, unwrapping a carved wooden horse, the kind Thomas used to whittle during long evenings. Said it was for Beth's birthday. He'd been working on it for months. Martha's breath caught. The horse was beautiful, intricate, clearly a labor of love. Thomas had mentioned making something special for Beth, but she'd assumed it had been lost with everything else when he died. "He was proud of his family," Hartwell continued. "Talked about you all the time, how strong you were, how smart the children. Said you could handle anything life threw at you." He paused, his voice growing rougher. "I came here tonight because I wanted to see for myself the woman who could inspire that kind of devotion. And I see why he loved you." The simple honesty in his words hit Martha like a physical blow. For 8 months, she'd been drowning in her own strength, carrying burdens that felt too heavy for one person. To hear someone acknowledge that strength, to see her through Thomas's eyes, was almost more than she could bear. "Hartwell!" The voice outside was growing impatient. "Last chance." Martha looked at the carved horse in her hands, then at the man who'd brought it to them, a man who had fed her children, who spoke of her husband with respect, who was willing to face 5 armed men rather than bring trouble down on her family. "There's another way," she said quietly. Martha opened the door before Hartwell could stop her, stepping onto her porch with Thomas's rifle cradled in her arms, not aimed, but ready. The 5 men sat their horses in a rough semicircle, breath steaming in the bitter air. She recognized the type, Drifters, men who hired their guns to whoever paid best. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen yard with surprising authority, "you're trespassing on my land." The apparent leader, a lean man with cruel eyes, laughed. "This ain't your fight, lady. Send Hartwell out, and we'll be on our way." "Mr. Hartwell is my guest," Martha replied evenly. "He's under my protection." "Your protection?" The man's laugh grew nastier. "Lady, you're one woman with 3 kids and an old rifle. What kind of protection is that?" Martha smiled, and something in that smile made the horses shift nervously. "The kind that knows every man in 3 counties rode through that storm to attend my husband's funeral. The kind that knows Sheriff Morrison considers me family. The kind that knows if anything happens to me or mine, there'll be nowhere you can run far enough." She let the words sink in, watching Dee out flicker across their faces. In truth, she was terrifying herself with her own audacity, but she pressed on. "More importantly," she continued, "it's the kind of protection that's already sent my eldest boy out the back, with orders to ride to town and bring help, if you're not gone in 5 minutes." This was a bluff. Samuel was still upstairs, but the leader's eyes flicked toward the barn, calculating distances and odds. Behind her, Martha heard Hartwell step onto the porch. "Like the lady said," he called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who'd faced down rustlers and wolves alike. "You boys best ride on." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to remind them all how vast and empty this country could be, how quickly a man could disappear into it without a trace. The leader spat into the snow. "This ain't over, Hartwell." "Yes," Martha said quietly. "It is." One by one, the riders wheeled their horses around and disappeared into the storm, swallowed by darkness and swirling snow. Years later, when Beth Hartwell, for that was her name now, played with the wooden horse her real father had carved, she would remember that night as the moment everything changed. How her mother had stood down 5 armed men with nothing but words and will. How Jacob Hartwell had become not just their protector, but their family. How sometimes the greatest acts of courage happened not in gunfights or cattle drives, but in the simple choice to open your door to a stranger in a storm. The wooden horse still sat on the mantel of the big house where Martha reigned, as the respected wife of one of the territory's most prominent ranchers, a reminder that love could be carved from the hardest wood, that families could be built from the most unlikely foundations, and that sometimes, when you fed a stranger, you were really feeding your own future. Stories like this aren't just told, they're felt. If you felt it too, subscribe and stay with us.